Well, I appreciate that kind introduction, and it is always a pleasure to be here with the Asheville Road congregation. I'm your preacher. I know I tell you that every year, but I believe it, and I'm going to say it as many times as I have to. I've come to love Drew for a number of reasons. I mentioned to you before, I knew about the Kaiser family many years ago as a student at Faulkner University. First heard that name, and then little by little I've met a Kaiser through the years, and I've familiarized myself with just about the entire family now. And Ash and his family are worshiping with us at Decatur Highway. That makes me love Drew more. He grew up with Ash and had to put up with Ash, and so I appreciate him even more now than I did before. But it is always a pleasure to be here, and good to meet Eli, and I know that he's doing a good work here, and y'all love and appreciate him, and so I look forward to getting to know him a little bit more. Song of Solomon, wow, what a book. How many of you have read Song of Solomon recently? You don't have to lie to me, you can be honest. Most of us stay away from it. And I think there are some reasons behind that. We'll talk about that a little bit as we go on. As a matter of fact, I told somebody I was coming over to Asheville Road and speaking on this series, and they asked me what my topic was going to be, and I said, well, I'm going to speak on the Song of Solomon. They looked at me kind of shockingly, and they said, did you lose a bet? No, I didn't lose a bet. As a matter of fact, I told Drew when he first sent out the list, and I saw that on the list, I said, look, if nobody else claims this one, I'll take it. I want that one. For a lot of different reasons. One is, as he said, it's a neglected text. I like to preach on neglected texts. I just like to dive into them and learn more about them and to share with people parts of the Bible that maybe you don't focus on a whole lot. But another part of that reason is because the Song of Solomon is almost looked at as the pornographic book of the Bible. Now that's unfortunate because it's not. But a lot of people look at it that way because it talks a lot about sexual things. Now, I hope that word doesn't necessarily offend you and put you off right at the outset. I remember when I was growing up, I was probably, I was a preteen, probably 11, 12 years old, somewhere around that area, and in between preachers. Our previous preacher had left. We were looking to hire a new preacher, the congregation I grew up in. And so several of the men of the congregation were filling in and preaching for us. And there was a sweet old gentleman, and he was sweet, and I loved him, and he was a fascinating guy from in so many ways. But he was preaching one Sunday, and I'll never forget, my parents, I don't know about your parents, my parents were sticklers about where I sat. I was not allowed to sit behind them in the auditorium. I had to sit somewhere in front of them. I didn't have to sit with them, but I had to sit in front of them. And they also were sticklers about whispering and talking during church, during a worship service. And so that was just something I didn't do. But on this particular Sunday, I remember my mother told me, said, now, if you want to sit on the back row with your friends, you can do that. Oh, there's something strange about this Sunday. And so I'm sitting back there with my friends, and this older gentleman, he gets up to preach, and this is the way that he opened up his sermon. He said, I want to talk to you about a subject that is so dirty, so vile, I can't even pronounce it. I'm just going to spell it. S-E-X. Immediately, I looked at my mother because that kind of perked up my ears. I looked at my mother, and my mother was already turned around looking back where I was sitting with my friends, and I could read her lips. She said, you can talk. She was ready for me to be distracted during that sermon. Now, bless his heart, he didn't say anything out of the way, and certainly nothing that was going to be vile or disgusting. But unfortunately, I think that's the way we look at things, particularly sexual matters in the church. We don't preach about it a lot, do we, Drew? And that's unfortunate because guess who created it? God created it. And guess who said it was very good? God said it was very good. And so why don't we talk about it? Why don't we discuss it? Do you realize that statistics tell us, on average, 50% of every marriage, one out of every two marriages, I'll put it that way, ends in divorce. Statistically, it is that high. Now, marriage counselors tell us that 80% of the problems in marriage have to do with communication. I told a story this past week at Decatur Highway that I heard years ago. A lady went into a lawyer's office and she told the lawyer, she said, "I need your help. My husband says he wants to divorce me." And so the lawyer, he was sympathetic. He said, "Well, ma'am, can I ask you a few questions?" He said, "Does he have a grudge?" She said, "Oh, no, we have a carport that we park our vehicles in." He said, "Okay, well, no, that's not what I meant." He said, "Does he have any grounds?" She said, "Oh, yes, he owns about 20 acres on the outside of town." The lawyer shook his head and he said, no, you still don't understand what I'm talking about. He said, what's the problem? That's what I'm wanting to know. What's the problem in the marriage? And the lady said, "Well, my husband says we can't communicate." I wonder why. Communication can be difficult. And it's interesting to notice that when you look at the Song of Solomon, you read through the Song of Solomon, it is indeed a song. It is a poem. But it is a poem or a song that is primarily dialogue. Dialogue between two people who love one another very, very much. Now, ordinarily, they tell us we communicate on 5 different levels. One level we communicate on is the frivolous level. That's where we talk about the weather, the sports, who won the game, and those kinds of things. That's the frivolous level that we communicate on. Second level is the factual level. Now, this is where we start sharing information with one another. And, did you hear about what happened? Did you see this on the news? So we're sharing information. Then there's the fellowship level that goes a little bit deeper. Maybe we're not just sharing information, but now we're talking about some of the ideas or talking about our judgments of things that have happened and things that are going on. And then there's the feeling level. That's a little bit further down the line where we talk about, how we feel about those things and what's going through our mind. The 5th level is what's called the freedom level. And on the freedom level, you feel easy enough with people you're talking to, people you're communicating with, to actually share some of your deepest thoughts, your deepest feelings, and your deepest desires. Now, there are not that many people in the world you're going to communicate on that level with. But if you're here tonight and you're married, I sure hope that you can look across at your husband, your wife, and that's somebody you can communicate on that level with. If you ever hope to get married, I hope that you will work to a point in that marriage, in that relationship, that you can communicate on that freedom level, because I believe that's what God has in store for us. When we think about intimacy, the word intimate comes from the Latin word intimus, which means inmost. So when we think about being intimate with someone in a relationship, we're thinking about a concept of sharing our innermost feelings, our innermost self. Unfortunately, in our modern world, when the modern world talks about intimacy, they're usually talking about physical intimacy. But intimacy really goes beyond that. It's more than just being physically intimate, but it's also being intellectually, emotionally, and spiritually intimate with one another. And we have to realize that the same God who gave us all things pertaining to life and godliness, 2 Peter chapter 1 and verse 3, is the same God who is the foremost expert on intimacy, sexuality, and marriage. If anybody knows something about the subject, God knows something about the subject. And when God speaks on the subject, we need to pay attention to what God is saying. And that brings us to the Song of Solomon. For far too many people, this is a mystery book, because we just don't touch it. We barely even like to read it. If you're on a Bible reading plan, we're at the Song of Solomon. Boy, maybe I can skip over this one. We don't like to read it very much. But This book is tucked into a category or a section of books in the Old Testament. We commonly identify either as wisdom or poetry books. I don't know how many of you remember the old charts, and we used to have a little card I remember getting in Bible school many years ago that separated out all the books of the Bible. You had the books of the law, and you had the books of history, and then you had the books either of wisdom or of poetry. Truth of the matter is, there are 3 books of wisdom. That is Job, Proverbs, and Ecclesiastes. There are 2 books of poetry, and they're all lumped together. Psalms and Song of Solomon are the 2 books of poetry. That's what they're intended to be. And in the Hebrew mind, in the Hebrew Bible, to the Old Testament people, this poetry was an expression of their emotions. You read through the Psalms and you see the emotions pouring out. We're studying through the Psalms right now over at Decatur Highway. As a matter of fact, I left Ash to take up the next section of Psalms tonight. And I taught the first part, and he's picking up in the second part. But it's amazing sometimes how these writers of the Psalms just poured their heart out to God. And you have to see that as you're looking into the text. The Song of Solomon falls into that category. But unfortunately, because of the Near East metaphors that are used in the Song of Solomon, many times it becomes confusing to us, and sometimes we just really don't know what's going on, and there's an obvious sexual nature. And I know there are some that will say, well, this book really, it's talking about Jesus and the church. Man, that's a stretch in my mind. You're really going to have to bend and twist and figure out some things if you're going to apply this to Jesus and the church. After all, what would that have meant to the Hebrew mind? What would they have thought? Because they didn't know anything about Jesus and the church, at least at that point. And so this is a book that is intended to express some real feelings. And so to a lot of people, it even becomes distasteful. And that's why it is so often left off. We read things like in chapter 4 and verse 2, your teeth are like a flock of sheep. Now, ladies, I know you married a silver-tongued devil, but what if he were to look at you and say, boy, your teeth are just like a flock of sheep? You'd probably knock him upside the head and say, what in the world is wrong with you? It's not an idea, it's not a picture we really understand. But in their world, in their language, it meant something, and it meant something very, very beautiful. Suffice it to say that the Song of Solomon, or the Song of Songs, as we've termed it tonight, and I'll say a little more about that in a moment, but the Song of Songs is a celebration of love. It's a celebration of love, according to one writer, that unfolds itself in 7 acts. And over those 7 acts, he discusses courtship, sexuality, and marriage. Every bit of that is touched on and discussed in the Song of Songs. Now, it is at times graphic, at times detailed, and sometimes, as the same writer said, downright steamy. And you might even get a little embarrassed reading some of those things if you're not accustomed to it. But it is a book that is necessary for us to read. Now, as I said, in some of your Bibles, it'll be called the Song of Solomon. In others, it may be called the Song of Songs. As a matter of fact, if I recall correctly, in the Hebrew Bible, that's the way it's termed, the Song of Songs. And there's a reason for that. You remember in Ecclesiastes that Solomon kept repeating the phrase, vanity of vanities. In the Hebrew language, in the Hebrew writing, there was a way of emphasizing something by repeating terminology. And so vanity of vanities simply tells us this is the most useless, senseless, vain thing that you can possibly think of. To describe this book as the Song of Songs tells us that it's a Hebrew superlative that tells us that it may be the most beautiful of songs, maybe it's the most popular of songs, maybe it was the #1 song of its day. It was a chart topper. Now, I put on the screen, if we advance, I don't know if you recognize these 2 guys. These 2 guys shaped and framed my childhood. Now, the one on the left is a guy named Casey Kasem. Anybody remember Casey Kasem? The AT Top 40. And Casey Kasem will come on and he'll tell you all the popular songs of the day. The other guy on the right is a guy named Bob Kingsley. Now, Bob Kingsley was the Casey Kasem of the country music world. When I was 17 years old, first job I had, paying job that was not working for my dad, I was working as a DJ at a country music radio station. Now, that's going to shock many of you because I don't sound like a DJ. And I tell people we were a real, genuine country music radio station because we operated out of a double-wide trailer in the middle of a cow pasture. That is no lie. One of the parts of my job, I worked every Saturday morning from 10 o'clock to 6 o'clock in the evening, every Saturday. And when I got to the radio station at 10 o'clock, the very first thing that I had to do, I had to cue up Bob Kingsley. And for the next 4 hours, I made sure that the country top 40 played without a hitch. I just turned everything over to Bob Kingsley, but I had to make sure it all worked. And that was 4 hours of my job. Now, as a 17-year-old, I'll admit, that was the most boring thing I think I've ever done in my life. But there's hardly a country song I've never heard. I can tell you that because I listened to so much of what was going on, especially if it was in the mid-'80s. I knew all of those songs. But I can imagine Song of Solomon popping up on the Hebrew top 40. And there it is at the top. It's the number one song. It's the Song of Songs. Now, one of the challenges when you're dealing with the Song of Solomon is to deal with the text and talk about some of the nature of things that are being discussed. Brother Winkler, one of my teachers in college, used to say, you know, you need to talk about some things, sexuality in particular, without becoming X-rated. And I don't believe the Song of Solomon is X-rated, left in its proper context. But there are some things that could be uncomfortable in a mixed company. And if you're a parent, you've got some young kids in here, maybe some of the teenagers over here belong to you, and say, man, what in the world is he going to say? Let me put your mind at ease. We're going to be okay. But I want to characterize the book for you. I want to encourage you to read the book. I want to encourage you to study the book. I want to encourage you to get to know the book because it really is a beautiful, beautiful book of poetry that is far too many times left out of our study of the Bible. And so what I want to do tonight is just give you some things to look for in the book, to consider as you read through this song. Now, every song has a tune. I don't know what tune was played as the backdrop of Song of Solomon. I'm not even going to try to sing you whatever tune might have been part of the backdrop of Song of Solomon. But another part of every song is its words. And that's what we're really key in on, isn't it? I've got a granddaughter that's 2 years old. Well, she's fixing to be 3 years old. It's amazing to me. She loves music, and her mother grew up loving music. I grew up loving music. And one of the things I would do with my kids when I would drive them to school, I'd turn the radio on, and I introduced them to classic rock. I was a good daddy. They knew what good music sounded like. And my younger daughter, she didn't learn those lessons as well, but my older daughter, she really knew the classic rock. And so she has now turned around and she's introducing her daughter to some of her favorite music. My 3-year-old, almost 3-year-old granddaughter has told us she wants a Shania Twain birthday. I don't know what that is, don't know what it will entail, but I can assure you that there are 3 or 4 Shania Twain songs that almost 3-year-old child can sing every single word. Your favorite song has words. Maybe it's your favorite song because of those words. We like songs because of the beat, but maybe more so because of the words. And those words mean something to us. Let me tell you something about the words of the Song of Songs. One of the things we notice in the Song of Songs is it is a song of plentiful words. Almost 60% of the verses of the Song of Solomon are dialogue between these two lovers. I mentioned that a little bit earlier. And it's obvious that each one misses the sound of the other one's voice. All they wanted to do was hear the other one's voice. Those of us who are old enough to remember talking on the phone that didn't have a screen on it, do you remember talking to people and you heard their voice? And just hearing their voice meant something to you? I think back when my wife and I were dating at what's now Faulkner University. She never attended anything but Faulkner University. I'm old enough. I attended Alabama Christian College before it became Faulkner University. But when we were dating, we would have been together all evening long. She'd go to her dorm room. I'd go to my dorm room. It's curfew time. It's time to go to bed. But we'd stay up for another hour just talking on the phone. We like to hear each other's voice. When we lived in Texas for 10 years, I loved calling my mother because I loved hearing my mother's voice. She passed away in 2006. There's been a lot of times since 2006 that I wanted to pick up a phone and just hear that voice one more time. To hear somebody's voice that you love, somebody's voice that you have that connection with, it frees one from embarrassment. These are people you know. These are people you love. It allows you to open up without restraint, to have a conversation with them about your deepest needs, your deepest desires. And husbands and wives, people who are planning to get married, you have to develop to that point. Now, so many times a wife wants her husband to talk to her. And those who have studied such things tell us that men, on average, speak about 7,000 words a day. Women, on average, and somebody else made this up, I didn't make this up, so ladies, don't come to me after this is over. Women, on average, speak almost 30,000 words a day. Now, the difficulty with that is, back in the day when the man went out and earned the living and came home and mom was taking care of the house, that the man had spoken all of his 7,000 words before he got home. And guess who was just ready to start on her 30,000? Mom was ready to tear into him and just let all of those words out because she had to talk to somebody who was an adult. That can become complicated. That can become difficult. And sometimes it may seem as a marriage grows older that it grows colder because we sometimes let the communication break down. Those plentiful words are not always there. Now, to help you understand that a little bit, men on average, in general, and I'm speaking in generalities here, so please bear with me, but men in general are goal-oriented. Now, when he was trying to court you, ladies, when he was trying to woo you, as the old language says, he was all about that. I mean, he'd go to lengths. He dressed up when he was going to be in your presence. He put on the smell-good stuff. He would buy you gifts. That was something he wanted to do. But then once he got you, did he change? Sometimes we do. I'll have to admit that. Sometimes we have to remind ourselves we still have to do some of that in order to keep this woman happy that we've already convinced to become our wife. But see, his goals change because then he's not in pursuit. Now he's trying to preserve. Now it's his job to provide for a family. It's his job to protect a family. It's his job to be the one that will build the home and give it its foundation. Now, women, on the other hand, are more security-oriented, and that's one reason that women tend to communicate more than men. They want to know what you think. They want to know how you feel. And they want to tell you what they think and how they feel. And very often they need more support from the standpoint of affirmation and confirmation of this is how I feel. This is what I am thinking. And that's what they're wanting from you. They want that comfortability, that security in the affirmation that they gain through your words. And so the Song of Solomon, in its plentiful words, it teaches us that men and women need to take the time to communicate. Men, we need to be better about it. I'll say a little more about that a little bit later. We also need to consider that in the Song of Solomon, there are personal words. Let me give you a few of these. In chapter 5 and verse 2, I slept, but my heart was awake, a sound. My beloved is knocking. Open to me, my sister, my love, my dove, my perfect one, for my head is wet with dew, my locks with the drops of the night. You notice that string of words, my sister, my love, my dove, my perfect one, is a pet name. It's a way of referring to someone in a way of closeness and intimacy, a term of endearment. Maybe you have a pet name. My wife has never been big on pet names, but I can assure you one thing. If I were to refer to another woman as sweetheart or dear, all of a sudden she's going to perk up. Because those are words normally reserved for her. And she's right about that. If you have a pet name for your spouse, husband, wife, whatever it be, if you're dating, you have a pet name for that person you're dating, don't you dare refer to anybody else by that name. Because you're violating that relationship when you do that. It may just be a verbal slip-up, but you're violating that relationship. And so as you have these names for one another and you share these names with one another, it's a way of conveying, it's a way of communicating that you are special, unique, and one of a kind. Let me show you something. In Ephesians 5, when Paul talks to husbands and wives, we often quote this verse, Ephesians 5:22, wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord. And we focus in on that word submit. We really want the preacher to tell the wives what it means to submit. I want you to focus on another word. Focus on that three-letter word, O-W-N. Wives, submit to your own husbands. The word own in that verse is translated from the Greek word idios. We get our word idiosyncrasy from it, at least as a root word. And idiosyncrasy, if you say, well, he has a certain idiosyncrasy. What you're saying is there's something about this individual that is unique. It's special. It's different. You don't see it in a lot of other people, but he has it or she has it. And it's an idiosyncrasy. And essentially, what Paul is telling these women is you have someone who is special to you, someone who is unique to you. That is who Paul is telling these women to clue into, to key into, and to focus their attention on. Don't worry about this man over here, or that man over there, or any other man. You worry about this man right in front of you, your own husband. And the language that we use can depict that very same thought. How we refer to one another and how we speak to one another. A little later in Song of Solomon 5 and verse 10, he says, my beloved is radiant and ruddy, distinguished among 10,000. Look at that last phrase, distinguished among 10,000. He was special. He was unique. He was number one in her life. And when you have unique language between, maybe you don't have pet names, but you have a way of talking to each other. My wife's grandfather, I always thought was a little unique. My wife's grandmother, I think, was the most perfect individual I've ever met. We've talked about it in the family. She may have sinned at some point, but none of us can figure out what it was or where it was. I mean, she's just the sweetest woman that ever walked the face of the earth and seemed to do everything right. But my wife's grandfather, his term of endearment for her grandmother, my wife's grandmother, was old gal. Now that sounds harsh. That doesn't sound very endearing, but that's what he called her. That's what she was used to And she appreciated being called his old gal. She was okay with that. Now, he didn't need to go out and use that with anybody else, but she appreciated it because it meant she was unique. No one or nothing else would ever take her place in his heart and in his life. And when you have that special language with someone, those special words that you use, it's telling them nobody else can take your place. It's personal. It's personal to you. A third set of words that we find are positive words. Now, I said 60% of the book is dialogue, and it's interesting to notice that there's not one single word of criticism or negativism in the book. Nowhere do they tear each other down or make a slight comment about one another, and you probably wouldn't expect it. Going back to chapter 5 and verse 2, I slept, but my heart was awake, a sound, my beloved is knocking. Open to me, my sister, my love, my dove, my perfect one, for my head is wet with dew, my locks with the drops of the night. That word perfect means flawless one. Flawless one. That's how he saw her. Now, again, she may not have been perfect. Like I mentioned my wife's grandmother. We know she was human. There had to be a sin somewhere. But she just seemed that way. How special she was. And in the eyes of these individuals, they viewed one another in that fashion. And they looked at each other in that powerful way. Now in chapter 1 and verse 9 we read, I compare you, my love, to a mare among Pharaoh's chariots. Your cheeks are lovely with ornaments, and your neck with strings of jewels. And then a little bit later in verses 15 and 16, he goes on to say, behold, you are beautiful, my love. Behold, you are beautiful. Your eyes are doves. Behold, you are beautiful, my beloved, truly delightful. You notice how many times he tells her she's beautiful? You are truly delightful. Now again, fellas, you may not want to tell her that her teeth looks like a flock of sheep. But find the words to tell her how special she is. Ladies, find the words to tell him how special he is. Make sure you communicate that kind of language to the person that you love. I don't suppose Solomon, this just kind of rolled off the tip of his tongue. This is probably something he thought about and had to write down, and this language didn't just come naturally. And so sometimes we have to sit down, we have to think about it, and we have to share those things that we think of deeply within our minds. And one passage that will help us with this, Colossians 4 and verse 6, Paul says, let your speech always be with grace, as though seasoned with salt, so that you will know how you should respond to each person. Salt adds flavor to food. Paul says grace adds flavor to your life, adds flavor to your language. Always season your words with grace. Salt is also a preservative. And grace can preserve a lot of relationships if we express that grace in the language that we use with one another. Now understand, grace is not giving someone what they deserve. It's giving them what they need. And don't we all need grace? I mean, I know it's easy to judge, it's easy to criticize, it's easy to tell somebody how dumb or stupid they've been when they make a mistake. But have you ever made one? Have you ever made an error? When you made that mistake, when you made that error, did you want somebody to come along and tell you how dumb and stupid you were, or did you want somebody to give you some grace? You see, that's what we have to learn to do. We have to learn to give grace in those difficult times. An angry husband or wife may say, my mate doesn't deserve that kind of grace. It doesn't deserve that kind of speech. But again, it's not what they deserve. It's what in that moment they need. You see, one of the key factors to intimacy is acceptance. To accept the fact that your mate is not going to be perfect. They're not always going to do everything right or the way that you want them done. And neither are you in their eyes. That's a great lesson in the church. Your elders, your deacons, your preacher, they're human. They're going to make mistakes. They're not always going to be right. We ought to give them some grace. We ought to understand, or try to understand in those times when maybe they've done something we don't understand or we don't agree with. But you know, acceptance and grace grows out of trust. Trust grows out of intimacy. When we grow close to one another and we share lives with one another and we share these kinds of words with one another, then it builds a framework for this kind of grace. You know, there's a potent power in praise. If you walk up to somebody and just tell them something positive, tell them something good, give them something that they can build upon, they're willing to do almost anything in the world for you. And in chapter 5 and verse 15, she even says concerning him, his mouth is so sweet. What a sweet guy. She just loved to hear him say those sweet words. Husbands, we need to take a look at ourselves sometimes. You think your wife would say that about you? Wives, do you think your husband would say that about you? Had an older couple friend in Amarillo when we lived out there, and the gentleman he had quite a sense of humor, and both of them great Bible students, and they had a wonderful marriage, but he always said his favorite verse in the Bible was that one that Solomon spoke, that it was better to live on the rooftop than in the house with a nagging woman. And his wife would kind of bristle when he would say that. He didn't really mean that. At least it wasn't his favorite because his wife was a nagging woman. But what if she was? You see, the proverb is still true. It's better to be on the rooftop than in the house with someone who's constantly criticizing, complaining, and tearing down. And so we need to have those positive words. One more thing I want to mention about the words of the Song of Solomon, and that is, most obviously, they are passionate words. Some of us will read the Song of Solomon, and you're going to get to sections of the Song of Solomon. If you read it the right way, you're going to blush. It's going to get to you in that way, and you're going to say, "What? I don't know exactly what I'm reading here." But I want to emphasize again, it's not X-rated. You see, sex was designed, created by God. It was given to man as a gift. What you see on television and in the movies, that's not what God created. What men want to portray to you is not what God created for His people. Unfortunately, I think, many of our views of sex and sexuality, particularly in Western churches, are more puritanical than they are biblical. Our concepts around sex and sexual matters have been framed more by the Puritans of old than it really is the Bible. Because you read through the Song of Solomon, you see how beautiful it is and how they express themselves to one another. And we need to learn to be a little bit more biblical and a little bit less puritanical in the way that we approach it. But as I mentioned earlier on, this was poetry. It was an expression of their feelings. It was an expression of their desires. They wanted to communicate one another. And as one writer said, these words and the kind of words you read in this book, they'll keep the honey in the honeymoon. They'll keep a relationship to where you want to be with and to share and communicate with one another. Notice just one section. This is the only one we're going to read tonight that might embarrass you a little bit if you read it right, but just notice these words. The voice of my beloved, behold, he comes, leaping over the mountains, bounding over the hills. My beloved is like a gazelle or a young stag. Behold, there he stands behind our wall, gazing through the windows, looking through the lattice. My beloved speaks and says to me, arise, my love, my beautiful one, and come away. For behold, the winter is past, and the rain is over and gone. The flowers appear on the earth, and the time of singing is come. come, and the voice of the turtle dove is heard in our land. The fig tree ripens its figs, and the vines are in blossom. They give forth fragrance. Arise, my love, my beautiful one, and come away. O my dove, in the clefts of the rock, in the crannies of the cliff, let me see your face, let me hear your voice, for your voice is sweet, and your face is lovely. You think these two people were in love? And they let one another know by the passion that was in their words. Let me tell you something. If we'll be plentiful in our words to one another, and those plentiful words are filled with personal feelings and thoughts and positivity and passion, it'll repair a lot of broken down marriages. It'll repair a lot of broken down relationships. And your words may actually help you to grow more in love with one another. And that's God's goal. That's what God wants for you. And I believe that's why the Song of Solomon is in our Bibles. Now, I mentioned earlier, for some of us, we may have to make some adjustments. We have to make some changes, and that's not always easy to do. For the men, if you only speak 7,000 words a day, and by the time you get home, you've used them all up, well, you may have to muster a few more. You may have to work on that. You may have to think about that. One lady said, the only time my husband speaks to me is when he wants food, sex, and to change the channel. That was before remotes. I guess that's a dated statement. But you know, sometimes the only time we communicate with one another is when we want something. That's the point. But shouldn't we communicate more than that? Shouldn't we communicate more things than just that? Now, you can't force the adjustment, but it needs to happen. And you need to work yourself into it to where you can build that intimacy within your marriage. It will give you freedom. It will give you positivity. It will give you so many things within your relationship. That sounds so much nicer than ours at Decatur Highway. Let me close with this. Dr. Christian Barnard is known as the individual who performed the first human-to-human heart transplant. He was a heart expert. He developed the aortic valve, or valve replacement, and yet in his book titled One Life, he tells the sad story of the fact that though he had repaired so many physical hearts, there was one heart he didn't pay a lot of attention to, and that was the heart of his family. And because he didn't pay attention to that heart, his family ultimately eroded. And he admitted it was all due to a lack of communication. It wasn't that he didn't feel strongly about them. It wasn't that he didn't love them, but he never really communicated it very much. And he lost his family as a result. The Song of Solomon is here to teach us. We don't have to lose our families, but we can develop an idea of love and sexuality and marriage in our homes, in our families, in our churches that is God-honoring and that is marriage and relationship building. And we can honor and glorify God by living our lives in that way. Now, the Song of Solomon may not be the most evangelistic sermon or song to reach out to somebody's heart. But in reality, if you think about it, every book of the Bible has a purpose. And that ultimate purpose is to point us to Jesus Christ. And the one who's going to teach us about love and grace and mercy, the one who's going to teach us about intimacy and caring for one another and building our lives around a godly principle is Jesus. That's why he came. That's why he died. That's why he ascended back to the Father. So that if we learn to trust in him and live through him, our lives will be exponentially better. They will be so much greater. And we will enjoy not only wonderful fellowship with the people we relate to here on earth, but ultimately, and what we really want, is that fellowship and relationship with God for all of eternity. And so tonight, God has communicated with you. He's communicated with you through His Word. He's communicated with you through the life of Jesus. And God says, I love you, and I want to save you. And if you're here tonight and you're not a Christian, you've not put Jesus on in baptism, tonight is the night. Tonight is the night to commit yourself to Him. Trust Him enough that you'll turn to Him by way of repentance. Trust Him enough that you'll confess His name before the people who are gathered here. Trust Him enough that you'll submit to be immersed into Him, to rise and walk in newness of life. And then if you've already been baptized, maybe you forgot what that relationship is supposed to be like. Maybe you've forgotten the grace and the mercy that you've been shown. And you've gone out into other places trying to find some answer to your happiness, some answer to how you can live your life, only to find out the answer was way back there in somebody you knew named Jesus. And you can come back home. And John says that if we confess our sins, He's faithful and just to forgive us and to cleanse us of all unrighteousness. If you would obey Him tonight, the invitation is open to you. And I pray and I hope that you'll come while together we stand and sing.